Greetings and salutations. Let me know if you can hear me. Take the first couple of seconds to scroll through the chat and see who's already here. Greetings. I see Terry is here with an unusual request that I think we can accommodate. Warren Zevon was a classic. Hello, Miss Kelsey Blaine Gibson. Angelica is here. Lovely. Claire Bear is here, of course. And Blonde Avenger. Hello, Meg. It's funny when I see a completely different alternative handle. Sometimes I'm not sure is this person trying to protect their anonymity? Can I call Blonde Avenger Meg? Is that okay? I'm pretty sure in this case it is. And Christina Beelan. I learned how to pronounce your last name. At least I hope I got that right now. Yes, Terry is good on reminding everyone to please hit that like button and separately hit the little share button. That would be extraordinarily appreciated. Very much helps with the algorithm. And I see we're above and beyond the call. There are 16 thumbs up and 15 watching now, so that's that's good. Good. Dari is watching with her kitty Olive. That's adorable. Is Ray there too? I'm getting to know the non-human people in households. That is adorable. And Terry has her newest foster. An 8-pound furry blind grandma what? I'm curious. I don't know if that's a small dog or a medium cat. Is that a medium cat? I don't know. When I've got this beast as my basis of comparison, he's more than two of those. Hello, Svetlana. Lovely you are here with us. Michelle Vanderpool. Wonderful. Good. Patty Pinkstaff is here. And, Robin Hood. Ruth Sanchez and Anna. I believe that means that we shall get going. Let us get underway. I'm going to start with this evening with a poem by the long dead classic poet Warren Zevon, as requested by Miss Terry. Werewolves of London by Warren Zevon. I saw a werewolf with a Chinese menu in his hand, walking through the streets of Soho in the rain. He was looking for a place called Lee Ho Fook's. Gonna get a big dish of beef chow mein. Werewolves of London. You hear him howling round your kitchen door. You better not let him in. Little old lady got mutilated late last night. Werewolves of London again. Werewolves of London. He's the hairy-handed gent who ran amok in Kent. Lately, he's been overheard in Mayfair. You better stay away from him. He'll rip your lungs out, Jim. I'd like to meet his tailor. Well, I saw Lon Chaney walking with the Queen, doing the Werewolves of London. I saw Lon Chaney Jr. walking with the Queen, doing the Werewolves of London. I saw a werewolf drinking a pina colada at Trader Vic's. His hair was perfect. Ow. Werewolves of London. Yeah, well. We shall now defer to the standard opening of a selection from Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats. Although Warren Zevon just made me just tickled pink. Oh, and speaking of tickled pink, here's Miss Kimmy Hills. Hello, darling. So, from Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, this is Mccavity the Mystery Cat by T.S. Eliot. Mccavity is a mystery cat. He's called the Hidden Paw, for he's the master criminal who can defy the law. He's the bafflement of Scotland Yard, the flying squad's despair, for when they reach the scene of crime, Mccavity's not there. Mccavity, there's no one like Mccavity. He's broken every human law. He breaks the law of gravity. His powers of levitation would make a fakir stare, and when you reach the scene of crime, Mccavity's not there. You may see him in the basement. You may look up in the air, but I tell you once and once again, Mccavity's not there. Mccavity's a ginger cat. He's very tall and thin. You would know him if you saw him, for his eyes are sunken in. His brow is deeply lined with thought. His head is highly domed. His coat is dusty from neglect. His whiskers are uncombed. He sways his head from side to side with movements like a snake. And when you think he's half asleep, he's always wide awake. Mccavity, there's no one like Mccavity, for he's a fiend in feline shape, a monster of depravity. You may meet him in a by-street, you may see him in the square, but when a crime's discovered, then Mccavity's not there. He's outwardly respectable. They say he cheats at cards. And his footprints are not found in any file of Scotland Yard's. And when the larder's looted, or the jewel case is rifled, or when the milk is missing, or another peak's been stifled, or the greenhouse glass is broken and the trellis past repair, aye, there's the wonder of the thing. Mccavity's not there. And when the Foreign Office find a treaty's gone astray, or the Admiralty lose some plans and drawings by the way, there may be a scrap of paper in the hall or on the stair, but it's useless to investigate. Mccavity is not there. And when the loss has been disclosed, the Secret Service say, it must have been Mccavity, but he's a mile away. You'll be sure to find him resting, or a licking of his thumbs, or engaged in doing complicated long division sums. Mccavity, there's no one like Mccavity. There never was a cat of such deceitfulness and suavity. He always has an alibi and one or two to spare. At whatever time the deed took place, Mccavity wasn't there. And when they say that all the cats whose wicked deeds are widely known, I might mention Mungo Jerry, I might mention Griddlebone, are nothing more than agents for the cat who all the time just controls their operations, the Napoleon of crime. Yeah. Yeah. Hello, Joe Warren. Yes, cats indeed. That's, we've, for those of you just joining us for the first time this week, or for the first time in a while, these are the poems that are public domain, written by T.S. Eliot, that were the basis for the Broadway musical Cats. I can't imagine T.S. Eliot envisioned people dancing with hairsprayed ears on top of their heads, singing memories later on. However, as we go on, if you're familiar with Cats, you will recognize more and more of the highlight creatures. So, let's go on with our first short story for the evening. Okay. I made mention in the story that there will be obelisks discussed this evening. What I was specifically referring to, if you haven't seen it in pop culture, an obelisk appeared in the middle of the desert. Forgive me right now, it's slipping my mind if it was Arizona or Utah, but it was just kind of out there, and it just seems to have come out of nowhere. And then Tuesday of last week, it just as suddenly disappeared. Now, you might infer aliens. However, the more rationally skeptic might just go, oh, this was an artist who couldn't take their stuff to Burning Man this year and did something stranger instead. And as the world took public notice of this obelisk jumping up in the middle of nowhere, he probably came in the middle of the night, or she came in the middle of the night to reclaim said art project and take it back to the art house from whence it came. Or, you know, maybe it was aliens. Maybe. It's an interesting concept, a very valuable one to a scientific thinker, that just because two things are possible does not make them equally likely. However, the reason obelisks are so extraordinarily central as a trope to science fiction is because of the man, the myth, the legend, Arthur C. Clarke. So what I'm about to read you is the short story that was the basis for A Space Odyssey 2001. This short story was originally published in 1951. And what is fascinating about this is to go through, by the way, it is, yes, Joe, it's gone. As of Tuesday morning, I understand. And, Utah? Okay, sounds right. And of course, Terry has an obelisk along with a flying spaghetti monster. I've got a flying spaghetti monster on the back of my car, by the way. One more showed up on the British island of Wight. Didn't know that. One appeared in Big Bear alongside Bigfoot, of course. But I confess, that was me, and I simply hadn't shaved that day. So back to Arthur C. Clarke. I was saying last week about Isaac Asimov that one of the really, really neat things to read about Asimov is all the things he got right 50 plus years, 70 plus years before the present in so many of his futuristic projections. So the ones that were wrong stand out as the exception, the amusing exception, rather than the rule. So as I read this short story, I want to point out a couple of things that we know now to not be true. A few of these things about the moon, for example. Arthur C. Clarke in 1951 was making the broad speculation that when we eventually put boots on the moon, we're going to discover probably all kinds of forms of life that used to live there, that evolved there, and is now gone away. Well, it was also the incorrect assumption that once upon a time there were huge oceans and pools of water on the moon. So the word mare, M-A-R-E, pronounced mar, that just means sea. So the Sea of Tranquility, for example, is one of the huge craters on the moon. The cool thing about Arthur C. Clarke and what he wrote when he wrote this in 1951 is anything that he wrote as far as a description of the moon that you can see with a telescope is dead on accurate. He writes about the moonscape as though he had been there in first person because he was such a good scientist. There are lots of physical descriptions contrasting how when you look off into the distance on the moon, you don't have the same visual die-off that you do here on Earth. On the moon, you can just see forever until the moon curves away underneath your vision because there's no air to obscure what you're seeing. He is absolutely correct in his descriptions of things like a 100-foot fall. How did he describe it? We'll get there. That a 600-foot fall on the moon will kill you as certainly as a 100-foot fall on the Earth. He's got a lot of these things absolutely right. But again, I want to point out a few misnomers. There is no life on the moon. As far as we know, there never has been. There is no liquid water in pools or oceans or in bodies. There is liquid water just in like little molecular forms, but you're not going to find puddles or anything like that on the moon. So, with all of the notes aside, this is The Sentinel by Arthur C. Clarke. The next time you see the full moon high in the south, look carefully at its right-hand edge and let your eye travel upward along the curve of the disk. Round about 2 o'clock, you will notice a small, dark oval. Anyone with normal eyesight can find it quite easily. It is the Great Walled Plain, one of the first on the moon, known as the Mare Crisium, Sea of Crises. 300 miles in diameter and almost completely surrounded by a ring of magnificent mountains, it had never been explored until we entered it in the late summer of 1969. Again, speculation. There were no humans on the moon in 1969. But that's when this story is supposed to have taken place. Our expedition was a large one. We had 2 heavy freighters, which had flown our supplies and equipment from the main lunar base in the Mar Serenitatis, the Sea of Serenity, 500 miles away. There were also 3 small rockets, which were intended for short-range transport over regions which our surface vehicles couldn't cross. Luckily, most of the Mar Crisium is very flat. There are none of the great crevasses so common and so dangerous elsewhere, as very few craters or mountains of any size. As far as we could tell, our powerful caterpillar tractors would have no difficulty in taking us wherever we wished to go. I was geologist, or selenologist, if you want to be pedantic, in charge of the group exploring the southern region of the Mar. We had crossed 100 miles of it in a week, skirting the foothills of the mountains along the shore of what was once the ancient sea some 1,000 million years before. When life was beginning on Earth, it was already dying here. Again, the big ocean bed-looking things on the moon aren't actually ocean beds, they're big impact craters. But the protagonist goes on in speculation. The waters were retreating down the flanks of those stupendous cliffs, retreating into the empty heart of the moon. Over the land which we were crossing, the tideless ocean had once been a half a mile deep, and now the only trace of moisture was the hoarfrost one could sometimes find in caves which the searing sunlight never penetrated. We had begun our journey early in the slow lunar dawn, and had still almost a week of Earth time before nightfall. 6 times a day, we would leave our vehicle and go outside in the spacesuits to hunt for interesting minerals or to place markers for the guidance of future travelers. It was an uneventful routine. There's nothing hazardous or even particularly interesting about lunar exploration. We could live comfortably for a month in our pressurized tractors, and if we ran into trouble, we could always radio for help and sit tight until one of the spaceships came to our rescue. Another interesting side note. Obviously, there were no form of space rovers, there were no moon rovers, there was no Mars rover. So there wasn't even a word for that yet, so Arthur C. Clarke referred to it as a pressurized tractor. Love the description. I said just now that there was nothing exciting about lunar exploration, but of course, that isn't true. One could never grow tired of these incredible mountains, so much more rugged than the gentle hills of Earth. We never knew, as we rounded the capes and promontories of that vanished sea, what new splendors would be revealed to us. The whole southern curve of the Mar Crisium is a vast delta where a score of rivers once found their way into the ocean. No, they didn't. Fed perhaps by the torrential rains that must have lashed the mountains in the brief volcanic age when the moon was young. Each of these ancient valleys was an invitation, challenging us to climb into the unknown uplands beyond. But we had 100 miles still to cover and could only look longingly at the heights which others must scale. We kept Earth time aboard the tractor, and precisely at 2200 hours, the final radio message would be sent out to base, and we would close down for the day. Outside, the rocks would still be burning beneath the almost vertical sun, but to us, it was night until we awoke again 8 hours later. Then, one of us would prepare breakfast. There would be a great buzzing of electric razors, and someone would switch on the shortwave radio from Earth. Indeed, when the smell of frying sausages began to fill the cabin, it was sometimes hard to believe that we were not back on our own world. Everything was so normal and homely, apart from the feeling of decreased weight and the unnatural slowness with which objects fell. Dead on, they would fall at 1/6 the acceleration that they fall here on Earth. I don't know how you're going to cook sausages and have a fire, but presuming there was some sort of hot plate and no grease to be spattered. It was my turn to prepare breakfast in the corner of the main cabin that served as a galley. I can remember that moment quite vividly after all these years, for the radio had just played one of my favorite melodies, the old Welsh air, David of the White Rock. Our driver was already outside in his spacesuit, inspecting our caterpillar treads. My assistant, Lewis Garnett, was up forward in the control position, making some belated entries in yesterday's log. As I stood by the frying pan waiting, like any terrestrial housewife, for the sausages to brown, I let my gaze wander idly over the mountain walls, which covered the whole of the southern horizon, marching out of sight to the east and west below the curve of the moon. They seemed only a mile or two from the tractor, but I knew that the nearest was 20 miles away. On the moon, of course, there's no loss of detail with distance. None of that almost imperceptible haziness which softens and sometimes transfigures all far-off things on Earth. Good detail. Those mountains were 10,000 feet high, and they climbed steeply out of the plain, as if ages ago some subterranean eruption had smashed them skyward through the molten crust. The base of even the nearest was hidden from sight by the steeply curving surface of the plain. For the moon is a very little world, and from where I was standing, the horizon was only 2 miles away. Another great detail. Exactly correct. I lifted my eyes toward the peaks which no man had ever climbed, the peaks which, before the coming of terrestrial life, had watched the retreating oceans sink sullenly into their graves, taking with them the hope and the morning promise of a world. The sunlight was beating against those ramparts with a glare that hurt the eyes. Yet, only a little way above them, the stars were shining steadily in a sky blacker than a winter midnight on Earth. Another good detail: the stars, as seen from the moon, would not twinkle. The stars, as seen from the moon, would be solid points of uninterrupted light. I was turning away when my eye caught a metallic glitter high on the ridge of a great promontory, thrusting out into the sea 30 miles to the west. It was a dimensionless point of light, as if a star had been clawed from the sky by one of those cruel peaks, and I imagined that some smooth rock surface was catching the sunlight and heliographing it straight into my eyes. Such things were not uncommon. When the moon is in her second quarter, observers on Earth can sometimes see the great ranges in the Oceanus Porcellarium burning with a blue-white iridescence as the sunlight flashes from their slopes and leaps again from world to world. But I was curious to know what kind of rock could be shining so brightly up there, and I climbed into the observation turret and swung our 4-inch telescope around to the west. I could see just enough to tantalize me. Clear and sharp in the field of vision, the mountain peaks seemed only half a mile away, but whatever was catching the sunlight was still too small to be resolved. Yet it seemed to have an elusive symmetry, and the summit upon which it rested was curiously flat. I stared for a long time at that glittering enigma, straining my eyes into space, until presently a smell of burning from the galley told me that our breakfast sausages had made their 250,000-mile journey in vain. All that morning, we argued our way across the Mare Crisium while the western mountains reared higher in the sky. Even when we were out prospecting in the spacesuits, the discussion would continue over the radio. It was absolutely certain, my companions argued, that there had never been any form of intelligent life on the moon. He was being really conservative there. The reality is there was literally no life on the moon, even bacteria. But he didn't care in 1951 to speculate quite that far out into the absolute that reality would hold to bear. The only living things that had ever existed there were a few primitive plants and their slightly less degenerate ancestors. I knew that as well as anyone, but there are times when a scientist must not be afraid to make a fool of himself. Listen, I said at last, I'm going up there, if only for my own peace of mind. That mountain's less than 12,000 feet high. That's only 2,000 under Earth gravity. Great detail. And I can make the trip in 20 hours at the outside. I've always wanted to go up into those hills anyway, and this gives me an excellent excuse. If you don't break your neck, said Garnett, you'll be the laughing stock of the expedition when we get back to base. That mountain will probably be called Wilson's Folly from now on. I won't break my neck, I said firmly. Who was the first man to climb Pico and Helicon? But weren't you rather younger in those days? Asked Lewis gently. That, I said with great dignity, is as good a reason as any for going. We went to bed early that night, after driving the tractor to within half a mile of the promontory. Garnett was coming with me in the morning. He was a good climber, and had often been with me on such exploits before. Our driver was only too glad to be left in charge of the machine. At first sight, those cliffs seemed completely unscalable, but to anyone with a good head for heights, climbing is easy on a world where all weights are only a sixth of their normal value. The real danger in lunar mountaineering lies in overconfidence. A 600-foot drop on the moon can kill you just as thoroughly as a 100-foot fall on Earth. Again, great details. Oh. We made our first halt on a wide ledge, about 4,000 feet above the plain. Climbing had not been very difficult, but my limbs were stiff with the unaccustomed effort, and I was glad of the rest. We could still see the tractor as a tiny metal insect far down at the foot of the cliff, and we reported our progress to the driver before starting on the next ascent. Inside our suits, it was comfortably cool, for the refrigeration units were fighting the fierce sun and carrying away the body heat of our exertions. We seldom spoke to each other, except to pass climbing instructions and to discuss our best plan of ascent. I do not know what Garnett was thinking. Probably that this was the craziest goose chase he had ever embarked upon. I more than half agreed with him, But the joy of climbing, the knowledge that no man had ever gone this way before, and the exhilaration of the steadily widening landscape gave me all the reward I needed. I don't think I was particularly excited when I saw in front of us the wall of rock I had first inspected through my telescope from 30 miles away. It would level off about 30 feet above our heads, and there, on the plateau, would be the thing that had lured me over these barren wastes. It was, almost certainly, nothing more than a boulder splintered ages ago by a falling meteor, and with its cleavage planes still fresh and bright in this incorruptible, unchanging silence. There were no handholds on the rock face, and we had to use a grapnel. My tired arms seemed to gain new strength as I swung the three-pronged metal anchor round my head and sent it sailing up toward the stars. The first time it broke loose and came falling back slowly when we pulled the rope. On the third attempt, the prongs gripped firmly, and our combined weights could not shift it. Garnett looked at me anxiously. I could tell that he wanted to go first, but I smiled back at him through the glass of my helmet and shook my head. Slowly, taking my time, I began the final ascent. Even with my spacesuit, I weighed only 40 pounds here. So I pulled myself up, hand over hand, without bothering to use my feet. 40 pounds. So he's about 240 pounds with his body and with his big-ass, heavy, hypothetical spacesuit that they thought of in the 1950s. I think that's actually kind of accurate with the old, NASA spacesuits. SpaceX now has a much better spacesuit, but yeah, I bet that's about right. That seems about right. At the rim, I paused and waved to my companion. Then I scrambled over the edge and stood upright, staring ahead of me. You must understand that until this very moment, I had been almost completely convinced that there could be nothing strange or unusual for me to find here. Almost, but not quite. It was that haunting doubt that had driven me forward. Well, it was a doubt no longer, but the haunting had scarcely begun. I was standing on a plateau, perhaps 100 feet across. It had once been smooth, too smooth to be natural, but falling meteors had pitted and scored its surface through immeasurable eons. It had been leveled to support a glittering, roughly pyramidal structure, twice as high as a man, that was set in the rock like a gigantic, many-faceted jewel. Probably no emotion at all filled my mind in those first few seconds. Then I felt a great lifting of my heart and a strange, inexpressible joy, for I loved the moon. And now I knew that the creeping moss of Aristarchus and Eratosthenes was not the only life she had brought forth in her youth. The old discredited dream of the first explorers was true. There had, after all, been a lunar civilization, and I was the first to find it. That I had come perhaps 100 million years too late did not distress me. It was enough to have come at all. My mind was beginning to function normally, to analyze and ask questions. Was this a building, a shrine, or something for which my language had no name? If a building, then why was it erected in so uniquely inaccessible a spot? I wondered if it might be a temple, and I could picture the adepts of some strange priesthood calling on their gods to preserve them as the life of the moon ebbed with the dying oceans, and calling on their gods in vain. I took a dozen steps forward to examine the thing more closely, but some sense of caution kept me from going too near. I knew a little of archaeology and tried to guess the cultural level of the civilization that must have smoothed this mountain and raised the glittering mirror surfaces that still dazzled my eyes. The Egyptians could have done it, I thought, if their workmen had possessed whatever strange materials these far more ancient architects had used. Because of the thing's smallness, it did not occur to me that I might be looking at the handiwork of a race more advanced than my own. The idea that the moon had possessed intelligence at all was still almost too tremendous to grasp, and my pride would not let me take the final humiliating plunge. And then I noticed something that set the scalp crawling at the back of my neck. Something so trivial and so innocent that many would never have noticed it at all. I've said that the plateau was scarred by meteors. It was also coated inches deep with the cosmic dust that is always filtering down upon the surface of any world where there are no winds to disturb it. Again, great observation. No air, no wind, dust is going to accumulate, but very slowly over eons. Yet the dust and the meteor scratches ended quite abruptly in a wide circle enclosing the little pyramid, as though an invisible wall was protecting it from the ravages of time and the slow but ceaseless bombardment from space. There was someone shouting in my earphones, and I realized that Garnett had been calling me for some time. I walked unsteadily to the edge of the cliff and signaled him to join me, not trusting myself to speak. Then I went back toward that circle in the dust. I picked up a fragment of splintered rock and tossed it gently toward the shining enigma. If the pebble had vanished at that invisible barrier, I should not have been surprised, but it seemed to hit a smooth, hemispherical surface and slid gently down to the ground. I knew then that I was looking at nothing that could be matched in the antiquity of my own race. This was not a building, but a machine, protecting itself with forces that had challenged eternity. Those forces, whatever they might be, were still operating, and perhaps I had already come too close. I thought of all the radiations man had trapped and tamed in the past century. For all I knew, I might be as irrevocably doomed as if I had stepped into the deadly, silent aura of an unshielded atomic pile. It's a great side thought. Whatever technology is protecting this thing might be irradiating him to the point that the Hulk is going to look like small potatoes in comparison to whatever's happening to this dude right now. He might be standing in the radiation of a nuclear explosion, and he's got no detectors on him, and he certainly isn't going to feel it. I remember turning then toward Garnett, who had joined me and was now standing motionless at my side. He seemed quite oblivious to me, so I did not disturb him, but walked to the edge of the cliff in an effort to marshal my thoughts. There below me lay the Mar Crisium, Sea of Crises. Indeed, strange and weird to most men, but reassuringly familiar to me. I lifted my eyes toward the crescent earth, lying in her cradle of stars, and I wondered what her clouds had covered when these unknown builders had finished their work. Was it the steaming jungle of the Carboniferous? The bleak shoreline over which the first amphibians must crawl to conquer the land? Or, earlier still, the long loneliness before the coming of life? Do not ask me why I did not guess the truth sooner. The truth that seems so obvious now. In the first excitement of my discovery, I had assumed without question that this crystalline apparition had been built by some race belonging to the moon's remote past. But suddenly, and with overwhelming force, the belief came to me that it was as alien to the moon as I myself. In 20 years, we had found no trace of life, but a few degenerate plants. No lunar civilization, whatever its doom, could have left but a single token of its existence. I looked at the shining pyramid again, and the more remote it seemed from anything that had to do with the moon. And suddenly I felt myself shaking with a foolish, hysterical laughter, brought on by excitement and overexertion, for I had imagined that the little pyramid was speaking to me and was saying, "Sorry, I'm a stranger here myself. It has taken us 20 years to crack that invisible shield and to reach the machine inside those crystal walls. What we could not understand, we broke at last with the savage might of atomic power. And now I have seen the fragments of the lovely, glittering thing I found up there on the mountain. They are meaningless, the mechanisms, if indeed they are mechanisms, of the pyramid belonging to a technology that lies far beyond our horizon, perhaps to the technology of paraphysical forces. The mystery haunts us all, the more now that the other planets have been reached, and we know that only life on Earth has ever been the intelligent life in our universe. Nor could any lost civilization of our own world have built that machine, for the thickness of the meteoric dust on the plateau has enabled us to measure its age. It was set there upon its mountain before life had emerged from the seas of Earth. When our world was half its present age, something from the stars swept through the solar system, left this token of its passage, and went again upon its way. Until we destroyed it, that machine was still fulfilling the purpose of its builders. And as to that purpose, here is my guess. Nearly 100,000 million stars are turning in the circle of the Milky Way. And long ago, Other races on the worlds of other suns must have scaled and passed the heights that we have reached. Think of such civilizations far back in time against the fading afterglow of creation. Masters of a universe so young that life as yet had come only to a handful of worlds. Theirs would have been a loneliness we cannot imagine. The loneliness of gods looking out across infinity and finding none to share their thoughts. They must have searched the star clusters as we have searched the planets. Everywhere there would be worlds, but they would be empty or peopled with crawling, mindless things. Such was our own Earth, the smoke of the great volcanoes still staining the skies, when that first ship of the peoples of the dawn came sliding in from the abyss beyond Pluto. It passed the frozen outer worlds, knowing that life could play no part in their destinies. It came to rest among the inner planets, warming themselves around the fire of the sun and waiting for their stories to begin. Those wanderers must have looked on Earth, circling safely in the narrow zone between fire and ice, and must have guessed that it was the favorite of the sun's children. Oh, I love that line. Those wanderers must have looked on Earth, circling safely in the narrow zone between fire and ice, and must have guessed that it was the favorite of the sun's children. Here, in the distant future, would be intelligence. But there were countless stars before them still, and they might never come this way again, so they left a sentinel, one of millions they have scattered throughout the universe, watching over all the worlds with the promise of life. It was a beacon that down the ages has been patiently signaling the fact that no one had discovered it. Perhaps you understand now why that crystal pyramid was set upon the moon instead of on the earth. Its builders were not concerned with races still struggling up from savagery. They would be interested in our civilization only if we proved our fitness to survive by crossing space and so escaping from the earth, our cradle. That is the challenge that all intelligent races must meet sooner or later. It is a double challenge, for it depends in turn upon the conquest of atomic energy and the last choice between life and death. Once we had passed that crisis, it was only a matter of time before we found the pyramid and forced it open. Now, its signals have ceased, and those whose duty it is will be turning their minds upon Earth. Perhaps they wish to help our infant civilization, but they must be very, very old. And the old are often insanely jealous of the young. I can never look now at the Milky Way without wondering from which of those banked clouds of stars the emissaries are coming. If you will pardon so commonplace a simile, we have set off the fire alarm and have nothing to do but wait. I do not think we will have to wait for long. The broad implications of some of the questions brought up in this short story written in 1951 is just stunning. Greetings and salutations, Dwayne. Thank you for joining us. Of one thing he throws out there, for example, is in 1951, it looked like the last thing that we were going to have to cross, the last great filter, was, are we going to nuke each other and make the Earth uninhabitable? I don't want to say that we are safely beyond that hurdle. However, it's staggering to realize in 2020 that the threat of nuclear war, which is now even greater in its potential than atomic weapons, as Arthur C. Clarke put it at the time, that's just not even the filter that we're currently evaluating in a time of global warming, in a time of climate change, in a time of global pandemic that a large fraction of our society doesn't even acknowledge is happening. We have so many more great filters in front of us. It's also interesting where Arthur C. Clarke, is taking for granted that by 1996 we will have had all the planets in our solar system explored, and that we would have found plants, bacteria, uninteresting little crawling things, as he said it. And he was imagining the perspective of earlier civilizations looking out into the stars and seeing absolutely no life, and ascribing this to a godlike loneliness. It's funny because in 2020, this is what we call the Fermi paradox. If the universe is so conducive to life, Enrico Fermi very famously shrugs, "Where is everyone?" The Road Not Taken by Robert Frost. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both and be one traveler. Long I stood and looked down, one as far as I could, to where it bent in the other, in the undergrowth. Then took the other, as just as fair, and having perhaps the better claim because it was grassy and wanted wear. Though as for that, the passing there had warned them really both about the same. And both that morning equally lay in leaves, no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. Two roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less traveled by. And that has made all the difference. I love now looking up into the chat and seeing solutions possible to solutions to the Fermi paradox. Terry says they're out there. I personally find in the 14, give or take, billion years that the universe has been in existence, I find it exceedingly unlikely that this is the only place that life has arisen. But in the vast ocean of 14 billion years, it is both possible that we are the first on the scene, and it is also possible that we are extremely late on the scene, that many intelligent civilizations have arisen, have come to fruition, and have found some great filter that rendered them extinct. There are lots and lots of possibilities. So it's a minute after 10, but I want to give Miss Michelle Hoover a little more material in the public domain. So I'm going to read one more short story, late as it may be getting. This is a story by Mark Twain. And as much of Mark Twain's stories as we think of as taking place in the heartland and steamboats in the Mississippi River, this one actually takes place in California, just a few hours north of here. This is called The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County by Mark Twain. In compliance with the request of a friend of mine who wrote me from the East, I called on good-natured, garrulous old Simon Wheeler and inquired after my friend's friend, Leonidas W. Smiley, as requested to do. And I hereunto append the result. I have a lurking suspicion that Leonidas W. Smiley is a myth, that my friend never knew such a personage, and that he only conjectured that, if I asked old Wheeler about him, it would remind him of his infamous Jim Smiley, and he would go to work and bore me nearly to death with some infernal reminiscence of him as long and tedious as it should be completely useless to me. If that was the design, it certainly succeeded. I found Simon Wheeler dozing comfortably in the bar room stove of the old dilapidated tavern in the ancient mining camp of Angels. And I noticed that he was fat and bald-headed and had an expression of winning gentleness and simplicity upon his tranquil countenance. He roused up and gave me good day. I told him a friend of mine had commissioned me to make some inquiries about a cherished companion of his boyhood named Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, a young minister of the gospel, who he had heard was at one time a resident of Angels Camp. And by the way, Californians east of San Francisco might know Angels Camp. It's a small town. It's really there. It's still there. I added that if Mr. Wheeler could tell me anything about this Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, I would feel under many obligations to him.
Simon Wheeler backed me into a corner, blockaded me there with his chair, then sat me down and reeled off the monotonous narrative which follows this paragraph. He never smiled, he never frowned, he never changed his voice from the gentle, flowing key to which he tuned the initial sentence. He never betrayed the slightest suspicion of enthusiasm, but all through the interminable narrative there ran a vein of impressive earnestness and sincerity, which showed me plainly that, so far from his imagining that there was anything ridiculous or funny about his story, he regarded it as a really important matter and admired its two heroes as men of transcendent genius in finesse. To me, the spectacle of a man drifting serenely along through such a queer yarn without ever smiling was exquisitely absurd. As I have said before, I asked him to tell me what he knew of Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley, and he replied as follows. I let him go on in his own way and never interrupted him once. There was a feller here once by the name of Jim Smiley in the winter of 49. Maybe it was the spring of 50, I don't recollect exactly. Somehow, though, what makes me think it was one or the other is because I remember the big flume wasn't finished when he first came to the camp. But anyway, he was a curious man, about always betting on anything that turned up you ever see. If you could get anybody to bet anything on the other side, and if he couldn't, he'd change sides. Anyway, that just suited the other man, would suit him anyway. Just so long as he's got a bet, he was satisfied. But still, he was lucky. Uncommonly lucky. He most always come out winner. He was always ready and laying for a chance. There couldn't be no solitary thing mentioned that feller had offered to bet on it. And take any side as you please. As I was just telling you, if there was a horse race, you'd find him flush. Or you'd find him busted at the end of it. If there was a dog fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a cat fight, he'd bet on it. If there was a chicken fight, he'd bet on it. Why, if there was two birds sitting on a fence, he would bet you which one would fly first. Or if there was a camp meeting, he would be there regular to bet on Parson Walker, which he judged to be the best exhorter about here. And so he was, too, and a good man. If he was ever seen a straddlebug start to go anywhere, you would bet you how long you'd take him to get wherever he was going to go. And if you took him up, he would follow that straddlebug to Mexico. But what he would find out where he was bound for and how long he was still on the road, still lots of boys here, they've seen that Smiley, and they could tell you that about him. Why, it never made no difference to him. He would bet on anything, the damnedest feller. Parson Walker's wife laid real sickly once, and for a good while. And it seemed like they weren't going to be able to save her. One morning he comes in, Smiley asked her how she was, and he said she was considerable better, thank the Lord, for his infinite mercy and coming on so smart as that with the blessing of providence. She'd get well yet. And Smiley, before he thought, says, well, I'll risk 2.5 that she don't anyway. This year Smiley had a mare. The boys called her the 15-minute nag, but that was only in fun. You know, because, of course, she was faster than that, and he used to win money on that horse. For all she was so slow and always had the asthma or the distemper or the consumption or something of that kind. They used to give her 200 or 300 yard start, then pass her underway, but always at the fag end of the race, she'd get excited and desperate, and come cavorting and straddling up and scattering her legs around the limber, sometimes in the air, sometimes out to the side amongst the fences, and kicking them up more dust and raising more racket with her coughing and her sneezing and blowing her nose, and always fetch up at the stand just about a neck ahead as far as you could cipher it down. And he had a little small bull pup that took to him like you'd think he one's worth a man's scent, but to sit around and look ornery and lay for a chance to steal something. But as soon as money was up on him, he was a different dog. His underjaw would begin to stick out like the forecastle of a steamboat, and his teeth would uncover and shine savage like the furnaces. And a dog might tackle him and bullyrag him and bite him and throw him over his shoulder 2 or 3 times. And Andrew Jackson, which was the name of the pup, Andrew Jackson, by the way, would never let on but till he was satisfied and hadn't expected nothing else. And the bets being doubled and doubled on the other side all the time till the money was all up. Then, all of a sudden, he'd grab that other dog just by the joint of his hind leg and freeze on it. Not chew, you understand, but only just grip it and hang on till they thronged up the sponge if it was a year. Smiley always come out winner on that pup, till he harnessed a dog once that didn't have no hind legs, 'cause they'd been sawed off by a circular saw. And when the thing had gone along far enough and the money was all up and he come to make a snatch for his pet hold, he saw in a minute how he'd been imposed upon and how the other dog had him in the door, so to speak. And he appeared surprised. And then he looked sort of discouraged like, and he didn't try no more to win the fight. And so he got shucked out bad. He gave Smiley a look as much as to say his heart was broke and that it was his fault for putting up a dog that had no hind leg for him to take a hold of, which was his main dependence in a fight. Then he limped off a piece and laid down and died. He was a good pup, that Andrew Jackson. Would have made a name for himself if he had lived, for the stuff was in him. And he had genius. I know it, because he had no opportunities to speak of, and it don't stand to reason that a dog could make such a fight as he could under them circumstances if he had no talent. It was always made me feel sorry when I think of that last fight of his and the way it turned out. Such a shame. Well, this here Smiley had rat terriers and chicken cocks and tomcats and all them kinds of things that you couldn't resist. And you couldn't fetch nothing for him to bet on, but he'd match you. He catched a frog one day and took him home and said he calculated to educate him. And so he ain't never done nothing for 3 months but sit back in his yard and learn that frog to jump. And you betcha he did learn him too. He'd give him a little punch behind, and the next minute you'd see that frog whirl in the air like a donut. See him turn one somersault, maybe a couple if he got a good start. And he'd come down flat-footed all right, like a cat. Got him so up in the matter of catching flies, kept him in practice so constant that he'd nail a fly every time as far as we could see him. Smiley said all the frog wanted was education. And he could do most anything, and I believe him. Why? Why? I've seen him set Daniel Webster down here on this floor. Daniel Webster was the name of the frog. And sing out, Flies, Daniel, flies. And quicker than you could wink, he'd spring straight up, snake a fly off on the counter there, and flop down on the floor again, saw as a gob of mud, and fall to scratching the side of his head with a hind foot, as indifferent as if he had no idea he'd been doing any more than any frog might do. You never seen a frog so modest and straightforward as he was, for all he was so gifted. And when it come to fair and square jumping on a dead level, he'd get over more ground at one straddle than any animal of his breed you ever did see. Jumping on a dead level, that was his strong suit, you understand. And when it come to that, Smiley would ante up money on him as long as he had a red cent. Smiley was monstrous proud of that frog, as well as he might be, for fellers that had traveled and been everywheres, all said he laid over any frog that they ever did see. Well, Smiley kept the beast in a little lattice box. You're the beast. And he used to fetch him downtown sometimes and lay for a bit. One day, a stranger in the camp, he was come across him with his box and says, "What might that be you got there in that yonder box?" Smiley says, sort of indifferent, like, "It might be a parrot, or it might be a canary, maybe, but it ain't. It's only just a frog." And the feller took it, looked at it careful, turned around this way and that, and says, "Oh, so 'tis. Well, what's it good for?" "Well," says Smiley, easy and careless, "he's good enough for one thing. I should judge he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The feller took the box again, and another long, particular look, gave it back to Smiley, and says very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." "Maybe you don't," Smiley says. "Maybe you understand frogs, and maybe you don't understand them. Maybe you had experience, and maybe you ain't only an amateur, as it were. Anyway, I've got my opinion, and I'll risk $40 that he can outjump any frog in Calaveras County." The fella studied a minute and then says, kind of sad like, "Well, I'm only a stranger here and I ain't got no frog. But if I had a frog, I'd bet you." And then Smiley says, "Well, that's all right. That's all right. You get a hold of my box a minute, I'll go and get you a frog." So the feller took the box and put up his $40 along with Smiley's and sit down to wait. So he sit there a good while, thinking to himself, and he got the frog out, and he pried his mouth open and took a teaspoon and filled him full of quail shot. That's little lead BBs, if you don't know what that term means. Filled him put near up to his chin, set him on the floor. Smiley, he went down to the swamp. He slopped around in the mud for a long time. Finally, he catched himself a frog, fetched him in, gives him to this feller, and says, "Now, if you were ready, set him alongside of Daniel with his forepaws, just even with Daniel, and I'll give the word." Then he says, 1, 2, 3, jump. And him and the feller touched the frogs from behind, and the new frog hopped off. But Daniel didn't give a heave and hissed up his shoulders like a Frenchman. But it wasn't no use. He wouldn't budge. It had planted as solid as an anvil, and he couldn't do more than stir than if he was anchored out. Smiley, Smiley was a good deal surprised. And he was disgusted, too, but he didn't have no idea what the matter was, of course. The feller took the money and started away. And when he was going out the door, he sort of jerked his thumb over his shoulders this way at Daniel and says again, very deliberate, "Well, I don't see no points about that frog that's any better than any other frog." Smiley stood scratching his head, looking down at Daniel for a long time. At last he says, "I do wonder what in the nation throwed that frog off. Wonder if there ain't something matter with him. He appears to look mighty baggy somehow." And he catched Daniel by the nape of the neck and lifted him up and says, "Why, blame my cats if he don't weigh 5 pounds." And he turns him upside down and belched out a double handful of shot. Then he sees how it was, and he was the maddest man. He set the frog down, took off after that feller, but he never catched him. And here, Simon Wheeler heard his name called from the front yard, got up to see what was wanted. Turning to me, as he moved away, he said, "Just you sit where you are, stranger. Rest ain't easy, but I ain't gonna be gone a second." But by your leave, I did not think that a continuation of the history of the enterprising vagabond Jim Smiley would be likely to afford me much information concerning the Reverend Leonidas W. Smiley. And so I started away. At the door, I met the sociable Wheeler returning, and he buttonholed me and recommenced. "Well, this here Smiley, he had a yellow one-eyed cow that didn't have no tail, only just a short stump like a banana, and..." "Okay, hang Smiley and his afflicted cow," I muttered good-naturedly, and bidding the old gentleman good day, I departed. I think we will leave that with the end of the... It's the end of the evening. As always, I'm going to leave the camera going and the chat going for a little while so that everyone can say goodnight to everyone else in the chat. I love the sense of community that pops up around these things. If you're so inclined, if you can afford it, please throw a little something in the virtual tip jar. And if not, regardless, thank you so much for coming. And I suppose I should open up the possibility for suggestions and requests. That's so obvious in music, and it's never occurred to me in this format. So if you have a request, preferably of public domain, because Miss Michelle Hoover, as you may know, is turning this into a public access show starting in January. And also look for tomorrow's released video on Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. It's going to be a release of an original song, some of the audience has heard it, but not this particular video. In any case, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I will see you for Thursday's Lovecast at 6 o'clock. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to Hunter's Acoustic Cabin. I will see you Thursday. Thank you. I love you all. Good night.